Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to today's Lunch and Learn session from East Midlands. We're delighted to have Alison with us. I will let her introduce herself and show her slides in a minute, but just to say, we were just talking a while ago, we think we did this a long time ago for the first time. Alison was probably still doing her PhD at the time, weren't you?
It was even before my PhD, Emma. It was after my master's and before my PhD.
Wow. Okay, so a tried and tested approach. Let's go for that one. Evidence-based approach, publication bootcamp. Hopefully it's going to be really fun sessions and really practical tips as well. So we'll over to you, Alison. If you want to introduce yourself and then share your slides.
Okie dokie. So from the beginning. Okay, from the beginning. Okay, is that working, Emma? Yep.
It is, yes. Sorry, I've muted myself.
Fabulous.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to Emma and Patricia for asking me to come and do this short presentation for East Midlands. As Emma said, I'm Alison Cowley. I'm Associate Chief Allied Health Professional at Nottingham University Hospitals NHS Trust. And I'm also an Honorary Associate Professor in the School of Medicine at the University of Nottingham, where I did my PhD. So as Emma has explained, this is based on a publication bootcamp that Emma ran after I'd finished my master's degree. So it's something that I've used, I've supported since then lots of different people to use, and I hope you find it helpful. And again, what we will do as well is that I'm happy to share these slides with you all. Just a note that I cannot see any of you on my screen, so if anyone puts their hands up, I can't actually see. But what I'm going to suggest is that we take questions at the end. Okay. So next slide. Okay, so that first part, when you either hear from your supervisors or your colleagues that you've been asked to publish something, often that first feeling is hit the panic button. It's this, oh my goodness, this is a big thing. And clinicians in particular often tell me that they feel quite panicky by that thought, sort of, oh my goodness, but also that there's some kind of dark and mystical art in how you write a paper. What we're hoping is that this session will take away the panic, but it will show you that, as with any piece of scientific endeavour, that there is a process that you can follow. And it isn't a magical dark art, there is method and approach to it all. Some of those considerations to take are the amount of time that we've got to do this kind of approach, but also how we juggle it alongside all our other competing priorities. So if you're studying at master's, PhD, internship level, or if you're working in clinical practice with a research role or alongside, finding that time can often be really, really challenging. And I think it's important to have that straight up discussion and be aware of that. So therefore, this approach is designed to help give you some structure, to help give you some clear timelines, to help you navigate through the publication process. So the learning objectives for this session today are as follows. So hopefully to take some of the fear out of writing for publication. And part of that is exploring some of our reasons and motivations behind why we might want to publish. To identify what publishers want, and then to provide you a structured approach to help you write an article for publication in 6 weeks. But also to then give you a little bit of time at the end of today to actually start that process. So as Emma said, I attended a session on this probably back in 2015, 16, and I did follow this approach and I did get a publication done in 6 weeks along quite a busy clinical role. So it's having the structure and the discipline to get you through it. So when we do this one in a room, it's often just getting you to reflect on why we might publish. So just having a little think to yourself. I can't see the chat, so we're probably not going to use the chat function, but having that part, what are our motivations behind why we might want to publish something? So it might be that part of publishing is actually to help you clarify your aims and analyze and interpret your data. So having that end goal of thinking, if I've got a paper, it will really help me tighten up my research aims, my analysis and data interpretation. It might be that you want to communicate your findings to other people who work in your field. And by that, we might mean people who work in academic roles. That might be around sharing with clinicians or members of the public or people who might consume or be interested in your research. Another reason we might do it is to actually give us peer review on the scientific and academic integrity of your work. So part of that publication process, as we'll see, is around there is a component of peer review, and that can be really helpful in terms of getting a publication, but also helping if you're doing, say, a master's or doctoral studies. It's really helpful career development. So whatever role you have, be that a purely academic, a clinical academic, it's an important part of our career development and can demonstrate our skills and expertise. The fifth point is it's expected of us. So if we've got specific research funding, part of that is how we disseminate our findings. So it's something that if we are funded, it is expected that we should do. And it might also be to help advance clinical practice or further research. So hopefully the research that we're all doing or the clinical findings that we've got are of use to enhance practice, to enhance care provision and service provision. Okay, so there's lots of different motivations as to why we might publish. But quite often it might be that we're publishing because this is something might be generated from our clinical practice. So from something that we have seen and we have found, and we want to share to really improve outcomes and experiences for people who use our services, clinicians who deliver them, or carers and family members who support. Okay, so there's often that real motivation is that we want to share what we found because it helps address an issue or a problem or a new area that we want to change. So when you're under pressure to write, I think it's important to really think what that motivation is as to why you're doing it. So is it that your supervisors or your funders have told you that you have to do this? Or is it something that you really feel passionately about? And I think if it's that second one, that you really think I found something that's really important, that motivation will help you see through the process of writing for publication. So, different types of publication to consider. When we're thinking publications, we're often thinking around a peer-reviewed journal. That's often the first thing that people think about. And that might be your original piece of primary research. It might be a review, such as a mapping, scoping review, narrative, realist or systematic review, or it might be a case study. But what I think important to think is that we can think of writing for publication as a little bit more broadly than that. More and more people use blogs to accompany their studies or their research projects or their experience. And so a blog although not peer reviewed, is a kind of publication. We might also be writing opinion pieces or perspectives, or even a commentary piece that is a type of publication. A conference abstract, a poster, or a book review. So there's lots of different types of publication. And for the purpose of today, we're going to focus on the peer review. So there's lots of different training that you can get around how you write a good conference abstract, which is a real skill, and how you develop and write a good poster. So I've just included them to help you think more broadly as to different types of publications will reach different audiences. But for clarity, we're going to focus on the first one around the peer-reviewed journal. So, depending on your article, there will be lots of different structures to papers. So typically, a scientific structure for a paper is likely to include a title, an abstract, background, methods or approach, results or findings, discussion, conclusion, and followed by a key message, references, and acknowledgements. So different journals in terms of methods or different approaches may have a slightly different structure, but for the ease of today, we're going to use this as our typical scientific structure. So, as I said, this is magic of writing a peer-reviewed academic paper in 6 weeks. And it's a tried and tested approach that I've personally used. I've supported lots of different people to use. So hopefully it's something that will just help provide you with some structure and guidance to help you write your paper within 6 weeks, should you choose to do so. So some first ground rules. What we're going to focus on is the output rather than the process of writing. And so by that, we're not going to be covering academic writing per se, because that's something that is often already covered in postgraduate and doctoral training within the university. So it's not going to be on what you write for the purpose of this, but more the process of writing. The ground rules are it can be done alone, but it's really preferable to work with one other person. And you'll see why that is in a moment. What we want you to try and do is to commit a small amount of time to review once a week. In that recognition that you may have incredibly busy roles, so maybe once a week isn't suitable, you're going to have to set that for yourself, but a small amount of time every week to focus on writing. But also to understand your motivations. So if that motivation comes from, I've done this amazing piece of research and it could really, really make a difference to other service users, carers, family members and clinicians, that will help you through the process. So I'm going to take you through an accelerated process that we would do if we were doing this over a longer period of time. So the first week, what we would ask you to do is to identify your writing critic. And by that, we mean somebody who doesn't know your work. So quite often we might be writing it with somebody, say one of our supervisors, some of our research team, and they know your work. They're embedded within your work. However, when you put something in for peer review, the reviewer doesn't know anything about you or anything about your work. So having your critical friend or writing critic is really, really helpful. So think more broadly than your immediate team, which is why, as I explained before, that Emma ran this session a number of years ago, and I was paired up with a clinical psychologist who we became each other's writing buddies. And I didn't know anything about that individual's research or their clinical area. And I'm a physiotherapist by background, and he didn't really know anything about my work around frailty, older people and rehabilitation. So having someone who is not embedded within your work was really, really helpful, because they can ask you some of those challenging questions that the peer reviewers might do. So you found a buddy. The first thing that we want you to do is to write down 2 to 5 key take-home messages. Okay, so the first thing you do, don't write the title, don't go to the top, write down 2 to 5 key take-home messages that you want whoever is reading your paper to take home, as the name suggests. And these 2 to 5 messages become your conclusion. So bizarrely enough, you start with your conclusion. So the first step is to take those key points, those elevator pitch, key take-home messages, and write that into a conclusion, into a paragraph. So you would draft that roughly between 150 to 200 words, and then you give it to your critical friend to review. Okay. So as we said before, those top tips are often having somebody from outside of your profession or your specialist area. They can often really ask those questions. Well, what do you mean by that? What assumptions have we got? So you've made your key points, you've read one, all you've done is written your conclusion and given it to your critical friend. Okay, then they fed back to you and helped you. The next step in week 2 is to start mapping your information and argument. Okay, so these are using bullet points and sub-themes. Map your arguments that support your key messages. And this will form your discussion. And this is typically 1 to 2 pages that you give to your critical friend. So quite often, people can find the discussion one of the hardest parts to excuse me, to write. So this is why we're doing it first, so that the discussion and the conclusion map to each other. Okay, so you start bullet point, what are those key arguments that you support your key conclusion? And again, swap with your critical friend. So week 3, you've got your feedback from your critical friend, and then you refine that discussion and your conclusion, and you go through that process until the 2 of those are harmonized and they fit together well. Okay, so you've done the hardest part at the beginning. Week 4. This is that part when we need to be then deciding which journal you might want to publish in. And this can often be quite a challenging situation for people to choose. Which journal do we want to pick? So normally it's good practice to say identify 2 to 3 key journals that you think would be useful. And this might be profession-specific journals or disease or condition-specific journals, or typically when you've done sort of your preparatory work where a lot of that research is published in. So pick a few, don't just pick one. And then the next important thing is to actually look at those author guidelines. So whichever journal you pick will have really clear guidelines for the authors about what's in scope, what's out of scope, and how they want that paper written, what that structure looks like. So it's really, really important. And as a peer reviewer myself for lots of different journals, it's really frustrating when someone doesn't follow those author guidelines. So they're there to help you and guide you through that structure of word count and expectations. So what I would say, once you pick those journals and you've got an idea of the author guidelines, try and look for similar papers that meet yours. So perhaps if you've done a focus group study, for example, or you've done a systematic review, go into those journals and download and look at a similar paper to yours in terms of method, style and structure. And that will just help walk you through the process. One top tip is that if you're not sure if it meets the guidelines of the journal, contact the editor. So on the journal page, it should have clearly who the editor is and who the editorial board are. Now, sometimes they'll reply, sometimes they don't. So just be aware, there's nothing wrong with saying, you know, I've written this paper, this is the kind of thing I'm writing. Is it something that meets your criteria? And by this point, now you've got the author guidelines, you'll have a really clear idea of what the structure needs to look like and what the word count is. Because I think one of those big challenges can be, particularly if we've been writing at master's and doctoral level, often we're writing, you know, a chapter which is 10,000 plus words or a dissertation which is 15, and going from something very large and then condensing that into a tight word count can be challenging. So having a really clear idea of what the word count is and structure is one of your key aims for week 4. And so by the end of week 4, you've written your discussion, you've written your conclusion, and you've got a really good idea on the rest of the structure and the word count and whether or not your piece of work fits the aims and inclusion criteria of that journal. And then you can start on your background or introduction. And again, this is something probably that you have already written somewhere else, either when you've been applying for funding or as part of your dissertation or your thesis. So some will call it background, some journals will call it introduction. But this is the part where it sets the scene for your work. And typically it's trying to say, this is the problem, this is what the current evidence says, and this is the gap. I find it quite useful when I'm structuring these to use PICO, but you don't have to use PICO, but it just helps give some clear sections within it and a flow to your argument. So again, being able to describe what the population is, what your interest or intervention might be, the comparison or context and the outcome. Okay, and then this can be preceded at the end of having a statement, so a paragraph of, and the aim of my study is this. And that's a really important part where you can see what the evidence is, what the gap is, and how your study is aiming to address or explore that gap. So then thinking about the methods, and in some ways this is kind of the easier part to write. So particularly if you have gone through ethics and you've got a really strong proposal and a protocol, a lot of this is already written for you. The challenge is trying to take something that might be quite large into a reduced word count. So just think of methods as being that recipe for what you did and how you did it. So how your work was conducted. So if somebody else were to have the same set of situations, could they duplicate what you were doing? And how you've considered validity, reliability and trustworthiness. So obviously different types of research and different journals will have different sections, but commonly you have a section which is design and data collection, recruitment of participants, how you identified your sample and how you analysed your data. And again, a lot of this you probably have already done if you've got a protocol, if you've been through ethics. So this is why we leave this till a little bit later, because you've kind of already done this work. Then to think about the results. So the key thing there is, as the name suggests, it's what you found, but did you follow that method? So if you said that you were going to use semi-structured interviews in your method, one would expect logically that you find the results of the semi-structured interviews in your method. And this should be very clear and very logical and linked back to your aims. So we're not going to go through what you write in the results, because that very much will depend on your methods, but also on the type of journal that you're applying for, submitting to, which is again why I encourage you to find similar papers in the journals that you're looking, so you've actually got some structure, and follow the author guidelines. And as we've said before, a good discussion should include a summary of your key findings and what this adds to the published literature. And that might be comparing and contrasting, but also a good section on the strengths and limitations. Because no matter how well designed our studies are, there will always be strengths to one method or limitations to that method. So it's important as authors that we're open and transparent about that. And that helps our readers and our peer reviewers understand sort of the strength and the validity and trustworthiness of our work. And then, as we've said, the conclusion, which you've already written. And the way that I like to think of a conclusion is, if you could have a key decision maker, 5 minutes, 3 minutes in a lift with that key decision maker, or that clinician or that patient or that carer or family member, what would you want them to take home with you? So, you know, your typical elevator pitch. All the work we do has got multiple messages in it, but in a publication, there's only so much we can include. So what for you and for your research question are the key take-home messages? So apologies, this is a little bit blurry. I keep meaning to rewrite this out myself, but I found this quite helpful, that most journals will have word limits, and to then be able to break them down by section is quite helpful. So for example, if you've got sort of, say, a 4,000 word article, you think, well, I can have 150 for my abstract, 300 to 600 for introduction and background, 300 for methods, 1,200 for results, 700 discussion, 300 conclusion. Okay, so this just lets you give a rough idea of how much should be in each section. One thing to point out at the bottom is to be really clear, and this is again referring you back to the author guidelines, as to what their rules are for references. So not just the referencing style. Some journals have a limit on the number of references you can include, but does your word count include the references or not? So that's why we've just popped that at the bottom of here to sort of help you see. And again, I'll share these slides so Patricia and Emma can send out to everybody who attended. Top tip. This is where referencing software comes in incredibly helpful. Rather than having to hand write and insert them, using whatever referencing software you've been useful. So obviously there's Cochrane, Revman, EndNote, Mendeley, whichever you've been using and you find easiest to use. Each journal will have a specified reference style that they want, be it numbered, Vancouver. Some journals now have their own referencing style that you can, I use EndNote, but you can then download their referencing style into EndNote so you know it's exactly how they want. So top tip, if you haven't got some kind of referencing software, it does make life easier. So week 5 is where you fill in those gaps. You add in those methods, you add in that background, and you go through that same approach. So this is part that you've already written as part of your other piece of work, and you share it with your critical friend. So already you've had some kind of peer review throughout each of those processes. And then your final week is week 6. So that's where you're going to look at the flow of that article as a whole. So does the background flow into the aims? Do the methods meet your aims? Do the results that you report match your methods? Does your discussion support what you found or didn't find in the results? And does your conclusion give you that take-home message? And it might be at this point, when you've got the article, that's a good time to then share it with your academic supervisors or wider members of your study team. Obviously, that's caveated that some academic supervisors might want to be involved in this 6-week process with you, but make sure that you have that discussion with your supervisory team. And this is a point, go back, check the journal submission guidelines. So looking at things like spacing, line numbering, page numbering, make sure that you've done what the journal has asked you to do, because it will save you going backwards and forwards. Then decide on your title and then write your abstract. So this is kind of a topsy-turvy way that quite often we think, well, I'll write the title because that's a really easy bit. Yeah, so you've left the easy part till last. And then this is that time where you want to do that final check from your critical friend or members of your study team. So you're ready to submit. And this is where you'd really want to check all your in-text citations, check your references. Again, when you've pulled them through from your referencing software, do that final check that they've come through like you think you're going to, because there's always one or two that don't come in the way that you think they're going to do. Check your tables, figures, and illustrations against author guidelines. So quite often they can have very specific recommendations around font size or image resolution. Write a cover letter. So most journals want you to write a cover letter. And this can be very much along the lines of, thank you very much for considering my article. I think, I would like to publish in this journal because. So it's almost like, why do you think your piece of work fits the readership of this journal? There's lots of examples out there that you can find on the internet, and I'm sure your study teams will already have example cover letters. Then you upload, and then you press submit. So using that approach, you have taken a piece of academic work or a piece of research and structured it into a paper which has already gone through a level of peer review within 6 weeks. Now, I recognise that 6 weeks, for whatever reason, might not quite work for you all. So that's where having that discussion with whoever your critical friend is to come up with a timetable that's realistic for you. But I would really urge you to kind of timetable within your diaries or however you do your workload planning, even if it's just for half an hour a week. It's amazing how much we can get done in a really short period of time. So well done, you've done it, you've submitted, you've written your paper. What happens next? Well, hopefully you breathe a sigh of relief, and then you await the next step, which is feedback. Now, awaiting peer feedback, journals should often tell you roughly how long their turnaround time is from when you submit to when they send you your peer review. What I would encourage you to do is to seek support in helping you navigate some of this feedback. Don't take it personally, although if it's something that you've worked on, studied for, got funding for, it can sometimes feel really personal when you get some of the feedback. But it's designed to help you strengthen your work. And hopefully more and more, those who peer review should be giving constructive feedback. So this bit was really good. However, you're missing this. Could you please add this graph in, or could you please explain this point? It's quite hard and it helps you build your resilience. And I think that's where you really need to pull on your wider network as well. So everybody goes through peer review. But remember, you've already gone through some peer review because you've had somebody who doesn't know your study area or your patient group or your methods have a look at the paper. So building this resilience to feedback and rejection is part of that academic journey. So that next part is I often find if I get something back and I read it and my heart sinks and I think, oh, they really don't want this paper. If they don't want it, they will reject it outright. At this point, they're giving you a feedback to help you strengthen your work. So try and bear that in mind, even though sometimes it can feel quite brutal. So I tend to leave it for a few days, then I come back to it fresh and I look at the reviewers' comments, and then point by point, I address their comments. And in this, it's quite useful to have sort of a table where it says, you know, in paragraph 2, you said I needed to do this. I have done this, and then show them on the document with track changes or comments where you've addressed that. And again, this is not something that you will be going through alone. Getting your wider study team to help you look at the amends that you've made and address the reviewers' comments is really important. So I just wanted to refer you to a researcher who is on Twitter. They're, I believe, an American academic. I may be wrong, or they're based in the States. And what this individual did is they wrote a reverse CV. So quite often when we're looking at other clinicians, academics, leaders, people are very good at saying, well, I got this funding or I got this role and I've had 50 papers published this year. This academic did a reverse CV. So they wrote down every single academic position they'd applied for and didn't get, every grant they'd applied for and didn't get, every paper they'd submitted that got rejected. And what they were trying to say is actually this process of rejection from one journal doesn't automatically mean that someone else might not pick it up. So I think it's quite nice that it normalises that sometimes this is that critical review and that rejection can be part of that academic process, and that's okay. And interestingly enough, at the end of his CV, he said, you know, the thing that's ever received the most interest is the article he wrote about his rejections, not his successes. So this is that opportunity now that we have outlined a 6-week approach, which we're going to share the slides with you, which you can use if you find useful. But equally, it's to then give you some space and time to actually start that process and really have a think about who you might want to pair up with. And this is where the magic of being in a room sat next to somebody perhaps that you don't know that you can start on, and it's a little bit more challenging over Teams. But what I really want you to just, we're going to have some questions, but then to spend the last 10 minutes away from screen on your own, really having a think about who you would want to be your writing critic. So as uncomfortable as it is, I would really urge you to think about it, someone who doesn't know your work. So it's really easy to pick someone who you know, but having that external clinician, academic, researcher to give you that scrutiny early on will just help strengthen your work. And it really worked for me having a clinical psychologist who was just like, well, what do you mean by that term? So some of those assumptions that we assume people will know about our specialty, our methods or our area. So when we finish, what I'd like you to do is to just have a little think about who that person or persons might be for you. Write down your 2 to 5 key messages and then start with your conclusion. That then is that first step and everything that you've done for week 1. So I'm going to stop sharing that screen now, and then I'll come off, and if anyone's got any questions or thoughts or reflections, we can have a discussion and take those questions. So let me stop sharing and hopefully I'll be able to see you all. I can see Emma.
Lovely, thank you, Alison. So I think let's give some people some time to collect thoughts and reflections. I've forgotten quite a lot of all of that, which shows, you know, I don't write anymore. That's my excuse. But I think what's really brilliant is reflecting on 10 years ago when we did this, And then actually, I guess I'm fortunate enough that I've seen you and Sam's careers progress, and you both completed your PhDs, you've gone and got different funding, you both write ridiculously prolifically. So it must work in some way.
It really does. And I think it, particularly when you're taking a big thesis chapter or a dissertation, it can feel quite overwhelming that you've got something that's, 10, 15,000 words, and how on earth do I condense particularly a qualitative piece of work into that part? So that recognition that you don't have to include everything that's in a chapter into it. So it does work, and it's something that I've supported a lot of clinicians to use within their practice for primary research, but also for other types of commentary pieces or case studies.
And that reflects from the comments in chat. We've got at the moment somebody saying just been trying to distill their dissertation down into a paper, and they're awaiting their reviewing response. So we've got a question from Jason. Do you want to come on camera and say it, please?
Yeah, sure.
Hi, Jason.
Good afternoon. Hi, Alison. Thank you for that really brilliant presentation, actually. I suppose my question was just on the critical friend. So should it be somebody that works in healthcare? Should it be an academic? Or can it be somebody that doesn't work in healthcare or academia at all? So, yeah, just some thoughts on that, please.
I would say, so again, it depends on what you're writing. So if it's a blog that is going to be sort of a public-facing blog, for example, I might choose a slightly different audience. But if I knew it was sort of, say, going in, I don't know, the biomedical BMC geriatrics, for example, I would know that the audience predominantly who review for that are clinicians and academics who work within that field. So I would often have someone who's not necessarily my profession, but works roughly within that area of work. Would be my advice.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So when Sam and I did it, Sam, as Emma said, was an academic clinical psychologist working predominantly in counselling services, and I'm a physiotherapist working in rehab services. So there's not a lot of crossover, or so we thought, but we did later discover there was in our work. So almost Sam was able to ask me lots of questions that I hadn't even considered. But what I would say is, in that part, I didn't go to my academic supervisory team, for example, because they knew huge amounts about my work at that point. I left that until later when they could see the full paper.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Let's see, do we have any other questions for Alison? So here we've got some questions in chat. Do you recommend any other writing courses?
Really good example. The one that Patricia's just put in the chat is really helpful. I think some of the writing retreats and the shut up and write sessions that are run are really, really helpful. Some of those are guided, but some of it is, it's a spare room and you go and sit in there and write. So I think I found that this process gives you structure when you're in one of those quiet shut up and write sessions. But as I say, NIHR have run some workshops that have been really helpful, and Patricia's pop in the chat some free ones. But if there's a shut up and write session, I highly recommend them.
There's also they're called Pomodoro, aren't they? Write for bursts. Again, shut up and write, but write really quickly, and then go off and do something, and then write really quickly again. And
so that was my other top tip as well. So throughout writing up my PhD, but also writing papers, I use one of those Pomodoro timers on my phone to say, right, you've got half an hour between another meeting, just turn everything off and write. And sometimes you'd be surprised quite how much you can write when you're under pressure. So there's lots of different apps that you can use to help with that.
So okay, so next question. I have an answer to this one, but I'll see what yours is. Would you recommend submitting a paper to more than one journal at a time?
No, I wouldn't.
Definitely not.
Journals do not like you to do that. So I think what I would recommend is that when you come up with your 2 or 3 journals, start at the top Okay, so if your preferred journal might be, for example, the Journal of Nursing Research, start with them, and then you can then have your maybe second, third, fourth option. So don't submit them all at once. Pick the one that would be your preferred journal. And it's not unusual to take people 3, 4, 5 different journals before they find their right home for it. So the structure might slightly change depending on the journal. But yeah, don't submit all at once.
And I guess the reasons for those, just to explain it, are that actually it's quite a lot of work to review for a journal, let alone the kind of the editorial admin that has to happen. But worst case scenario, say it got published or accepted in 2 places, one of them would be considered plagiarism, because you can actually plagiarize yourself if you don't cite yourself properly. So yeah, definitely don't do more than one at a time. Any more questions or comments? But go on.
One other thing that I've thought as well is having a really clear understanding of whichever journal you're choosing, if they have open access charges. So in those author guidelines, you will know which journals are free to publish in, but also which journals there is a cost associated with. So sometimes that very much dictates if within your grant or your fellowship, if you have funding built in to pay for your open access costs. So it's worth laying that out there from the beginning, that obviously we don't need to write and then find out right at the end that you've got to pay something. So all journals should be very open and upfront with if there is a cost associated with that.
Yeah, and I think let everybody know it's becoming more and more tricky for universities to find cash if it's not written into funding bodies. And I'm presuming the NHS will be exactly the same. People are writing as clinicians. Write your open access into your funding applications, because long gone are the days where we could find, some papers are £3,000 for open access fee. You can't find £3,000 down the back of a metaphorical sofa these days. So yeah, a really useful. Some universities will bulk buy kind of subscriptions to open access fees as well, but it's not for every single journal. So yeah, do a bit of research, aim high, but be realistic, I guess, is also the take homes.